Johann Hari, Chasing the Scream, The First and Last Days of the War on Drugs. Step into a world where the war on drugs takes a surprising turn, chasing its origins and examining its far-reaching consequences. In the book, Chasing the Scream, The First and Last Days of the War on Drugs, Johann Hari helps you explore the murky depths of this prolonged battle, from its inception in the early 20th century to the present day. Delve into critical topics such as the metamorphosis of drug use, Harry Anslinger's role in global prohibition, drug-related crime cycles, and the misconceptions about addiction. Learn about the transformative potential of decriminalization and even legalization, as seen in countries like Switzerland and Portugal. Brace yourself for an enlightening journey through the complexities and contradictions of the war on drugs.
Origins of the War on Drugs. Today's widespread illicit drug crackdown, the war on drugs, contrasts starkly with the early 20th century when drugs were legal and widely available. The 1914 U.S. drug prohibition resulted from social anxieties due to World War I and industrialization. The global hardline prohibition was primarily driven by Harry Anslinger, the first chief of the U.S. Federal Bureau of Narcotics. By leveraging American geopolitical power, Anslinger convinced the United Nations in the 1950s to adopt prohibition policies worldwide. The ubiquity of the war on drugs has numbed our reactions to news of major drug seizures and arrests. However, the foundations of this anti-drug crusade greatly differ from its current practice. Rewind to the early 20th century and you'll find heroin, cocaine, and other now illicit drugs readily obtainable and legal around the world. Pharmacies provided a wealth of medicines that incorporated these drugs. Coca-Cola contained coca plant extracts which produce cocaine, and elite British women of high society were even offered tins of heroin at posh department stores. The tide shifted dramatically in 1914 with the onset of U.S. drug prohibition. World War I and rapid industrialization fueled a heightened atmosphere of anxiety and aggression, driving Americans to find a scapegoat. Drugs, embodying concrete objects that could be destroyed, were blamed for the abstract challenges of modern society, including class conflict, displacement, and shifts in customs. A crucial turning point in the hardline worldwide drug prohibition was Harry Anslinger's appointment as the first chief of the U.S. Federal Bureau of Narcotics from 1930 to 1962. Despite his active suppression of drug trafficking, narcotics continued to pour into the American market. Anslinger speculated communist involvement, believing drug addiction would weaken America's military and economic prowess. In the 1950s, he presented his case to the United Nations and, by capitalizing on America's geopolitical dominance, convinced the member nations to adopt prohibition policies globally. This marked a pivotal moment when the war on drugs transformed from a national effort to a worldwide campaign. Unmasking the War on Drugs. Often believed to be a noble cause, the war on drugs has perpetuated many misconceptions. Rather than combating addiction and social harm, its inception in 1914 was rooted in suppressing racial minorities. This racial bias can be seen in the discriminatory policies of the time, with white addicts receiving help and black addicts being relentlessly targeted. Public fear and prejudice enabled the war on drugs to maintain widespread support, glossing over the deeper issues of structural racism and poverty in the United States. In the early days of the war on drugs, it was widely believed to be a force for good in society, with a primary goal of protecting addicts from self-destruction and preventing addiction in others. However, there is much more to the story. The inception of the war on drugs in 1914 was not about addiction or social harm. Instead, those who championed the cause sought to suppress racial minorities. Harry Anslinger, a key figure in the campaign, openly targeted black people in his interviews, claiming the dramatic increase in drug addiction was solely due to their actions. This racially charged mindset influenced the policies when enforcing drug laws. A clear example of this racial bias can be seen in the contrasting treatment of two well-known heroin addicts, Billie Holiday and Judy Garland. Both were celebrities, but while Holiday, a black woman, faced relentless harassment from Anslinger's agents, white singer Garland was offered support and protection from law enforcement while she recuperated from her addiction. Emboldened by fear and prejudice against racial minorities, the war on drugs gained broad support throughout the United States. It was more comfortable for many white citizens to assume that the anger among African Americans stemmed from foreign drugs, rather than addressing the root causes in structural racism and poverty. By promoting the idea that controlling these drugs would pacify minorities, the war on drugs effectively diverted attention away from the deeper issues of inequality and injustice that permeated society at the time. Profiteering from drug criminalization. Harry Anslinger's crusade against drug use, aimed at eradicating drugs from the streets, instead caused the emergence of criminal networks that took advantage of demand for the prohibited substances. These networks charged exorbitant rates for drugs like morphine, resulting in addicts turning to petty crimes and the descent into a life overwhelmed by addiction. The war on drugs unintentionally enabled the growth of the very enemy it sought to eliminate and disrupted the lives of those it intended to save. When the crusade against drug use led by Harry Anslinger and his associates was set in motion, they predicted that drugs would simply vanish from circulation. However, criminalization does not eradicate products with significant demand, it only makes their acquisition illegal. This is notably true for drugs. Addictions create an overwhelming need that drives individuals to obtain them through any means necessary. This led to the emergence of criminal networks that capitalized on controlling the supply and distribution of illegal drugs. They exploited the situation by hiking up prices, knowing that addicts had no choice but to pay. Soaring drug prices fueled a vicious cycle, forcing addicts to engage in petty crimes to cover the expense. The modern perception of a junkie, a person entangled in a life of crime, stealing, and other illegal activities, is rooted in the war on drugs. The criminalization of drugs rendered serious drug addiction a debilitating condition. Affordable, regulated drugs, which enabled relatively normal lives, were replaced with a ruthless approach that disrupted careers and personal obligations. The war on drugs paradoxically created the very enemy it aimed to defeat throughout the 20th century. The ineffectiveness of drug wars. The war on drugs might be expected to reduce drug-related crime, but the reality is far from it. Arresting dealers only temporarily halts drug activity, as new criminals swiftly take their place. Moreover, prohibition has normalized and even rewarded brutal violence within criminal organizations. Gangs resort to extreme brutality to protect their products and instill fear in rivals, leading to an escalating cycle of cruelty. The fight against drugs appears never-ending. You might assume that as the war on drugs continues, drug-related crime would decline. However, unlike other criminal activities, arresting drug dealers doesn't lead to a long-lasting reduction in drug dealing. Consider the case of NYPD officer Michael Levine, who arrested 80% of drug dealers on a notorious Manhattan block only for the drug trade to return to normal within weeks. New dealers inevitably fill the void left in the market. Moreover, prohibition has fueled a brutal culture of violence within criminal organizations. Since gangs cannot seek legal protection for their products, they use ruthless and sadistic tactics to deter thieves and rivals. As rivals respond in kind, an escalating cycle of savagery ensues. This paradoxically intensifies violent crime, particularly when power vacuums arise after authorities capture high-ranking criminals. Undeniably, the war on drugs has created more problems than it has solved, intensifying violence and not nearly eliminating drug-related crimes. Rethinking addiction and drugs. The war on drugs has been ineffective largely due to misconceptions about the nature of addiction and a lack of understanding of the cycle of violence. Contrary to popular belief, addiction isn't solely a result of consistent drug usage. Research indicates that no drug is universally addictive. Rather, addiction arises from the combination of potentially addictive substances and individuals who are predisposed to addiction. Factors such as childhood trauma, social isolation, and the disintegration of communities contribute significantly to a person's susceptibility to addiction. Recognizing these elements is essential in developing a more effective approach to addressing drug addiction and associated problems. A common error in our understanding of drug addiction is that consistent usage of a drug inevitably leads to addiction. This notion is contradicted by empirical data. For instance, patients with significant exposure to opiates for pain management after surgeries rarely become addicted to the drugs. A study by the Canadian Journal of Medicine supports this observation, indicating that patients prescribed opiates are not more likely to develop addiction than the general population. This evidence implies that no drug is inherently addictive. Addiction occurs when potentially addictive substances interact with individuals predisposed to addiction. In many instances, susceptibility to addiction is rooted in childhood trauma or experiences of social isolation, where people lack meaningful connections with others. Additionally, drug addiction is often prevalent in societies experiencing societal breakdown and displacement. A classic example can be observed in the deindustrialization that occurred in American cities during the 1970s and 1980s. As employment opportunities diminished, communities began to disintegrate, and addiction served as a substitute for the missing social bonds. In light of these findings, the current war on drugs proves inadequate in addressing the complex nature of addiction. A new, well-informed approach is necessary to replace this failing strategy and ultimately alleviate the issues stemming from addiction. Decriminalizing possession, combating addiction. The failures of the war on drugs have prompted the search for more effective ways to approach addiction. Decriminalizing drug possession can reduce the stigma associated with addiction and encourage addicts to seek help. When drug use is not criminalized, people are more likely to be honest about their history, allowing for better support and resources. Examining the Swiss and Portuguese models, decriminalization has enabled the creation of sanitary injection centers, lowered drug use rates, and transformed the role of police into consultants. The outcome of these policies highlights the shift in perception and approach to treating addiction as a health issue rather than a criminal one. The war on drugs inefficiency prompts the need for alternative strategies to fight addiction. One such approach is decriminalizing drug possession, which eliminates the stigma around addiction and helps addicts seek necessary help. Openness about drug use history can lead to better support and resources from authorities. Switzerland's supervised injection centers and Portugal's decriminalization policy exemplify how shifting attitudes towards addiction make a difference. Decriminalization encourages viewing addicts as individuals needing help, not criminals to be disciplined. Portugal's policy change led to a significant decrease in drug use, especially drug injections, showing that removing criminal penalties doesn't encourage higher drug use. Implementing policies like these demonstrates the need to treat addiction as a health issue and align authorities' roles accordingly. The Legalization Solution. In recent years, the conversation around drug decriminalization has gained substantial momentum. However, simply allowing individuals to use drugs without penalizing them does not address the core issue. A more effective solution is the outright legalization of drugs, providing governments with the ability to regulate access, minimize use among minors, harness significant economic benefits, and dismantle drug-related criminal syndicates. Legalizing drugs would enable governments to control access far more efficiently than the current criminalization approach. Consider alcohol, a regulated substance that is almost never sold illicitly on streets or around educational institutions. This is because legal retailers have no incentive to engage in illegal behavior, whereas the sale of contraband drugs is already unlawful, with dealers possessing little reason to deny sales to minors. Counterintuitively, legalized drugs would create a stronger protective barrier for vulnerable adolescents. Furthermore, the economic implications cannot be overlooked. For instance, the United States alone could save $41 billion every year by ceasing the pursuit, prosecution, and imprisonment of drug offenders. Taxation of previously illegal substances, akin to alcohol and tobacco, could bring in an additional $46.7 billion annually in revenue. In total, an extra $87.7 billion would be available to fund essential public services, including rehabilitation programs for addicts. Legalization would also devastate drug-related criminal organizations, forcing them to abandon a now legal enterprise as regulated pharmacies and licensed stores take over distribution. Deprived of their primary revenue stream, these criminal groups would face financial struggles, subsequently diminishing their ability to inflict harm upon communities. It's crucial to remember that drug use does not equate to moral failure. Addicts, if provided the option, would choose to obtain their drugs from reputable, regulated sources rather than seedy back-alley dealers. Ultimately, those facing addiction are human beings with dignity, deserving of compassion and understanding. Legalizing drugs presents a more humane and effective approach to a long-standing global issue.
After diving deep into the book's summary, it is clear that the inception of the war on drugs was fueled by racial prejudices, misconceptions about addiction, and political motivations. The challenges faced by addicts have significantly evolved since the early phases of this war, giving rise to a dangerous and violent criminal underworld. However, by studying countries that have adopted decriminalization or even legalization policies, we gain invaluable insights into the issues at hand. Challenging popular fear, these policies show potential to dramatically reduce drug-related crimes and address addiction more humanely. In a world where approaching these topics with an open mind is essential, remember that those struggling with addiction are humans deserving of care and understanding, regardless of their circumstances.